Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 20th of March. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
Before we start this week's CEC Report, Craig, we should just acknowledge we have received the news that the former Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Fraser, has passed away. And we want to acknowledge Mr. Fraser because we've spent some time in the last few years working with him on the question of stopping the build-up of war against China and Russia that's leading the world to nuclear war.
Yeah, Robbie, he's one of the few sane voices that has been speaking out against it here in Australia, very strongly and forcefully, actually.
Yeah, and he's someone that was he was Prime Minister for, I think, nearly 8 years or 8 years. At the time, he was the second longest Prime Minister in Australia's history, so he was a dominant figure in the political life of a whole generation of Australians, and probably most people would have a view of him. I will say that people do have to understand about whatever they remember of Fraser back when he was Prime Minister and notorious statements like life wasn't meant to be easy, etc. Later in life, Mr. Fraser quit his membership of the Liberal Party, which he had a life membership of, and he did it on issues of principle, such as the mistreatment of asylum seekers, right? That is now a bipartisan policy in Australia, and he actually stood up on these kind of principles. He was. You and I had a discussion with him, Craig, about national sovereignty, which was his fierce bugbear that Australia has no sovereignty. And we put out statements about this, and he was very concerned that the current direction of the containment of China and, of course, what's happening in Europe with the eastward expansion of NATO, to contain Russia, is going to lead the world to nuclear war. It's something which cannot be tolerated.
Yeah, Robbie, 25 years ago when we founded the CEC, Mr. Fraser represented the old school Liberals, and
yep.
what's really quite funny is that people think that Mr. Fraser's changed. He's gone to the left more. You hear this standard discussion about Fraser's gone to the left. That's why he left his Liberal Party behind. That wasn't the case. No. The problem is, as we're seeing today, is the Liberal Party's gone so far to the right towards real fascist policies that Mr. Fraser has actually stood firm on it, and there's no deviation from what he said 25 years ago to what he said today.
No, that's right. He didn't change. Politics around him changed. Right. It got nasty, it got fascist in a bipartisan way, and he stayed firm. And you're right about people decrying him as a left-winger. I was confronted at a military conference that I attended, and because I just happened to quote him on this question of war, someone spat back at me, "Fraser, he's a commie." And that is such a bizarre thing to say about Malcolm Fraser of all people, but that's the attitude that changed. So you're right, Craig, he didn't change, politics changed around him, and he deserves to be lauded for the principles that he held to, which were humanitarian principles at the end of the day, and we know that from direct experience. So veil Malcolm Fraser, and we'll put out a written statement in due course that basically acknowledges him in a formal way by the Citizens Electoral Council. So let's now move on to this week's CEC report. We have 2 items today. 1, calling the Sydney siege an ISIS attack serves ASIO's surveillance state. And 2, 11th hour interventions to stop nuclear war and global economic disintegration. So first, calling the Sydney siege an ISIS attack serves ASIO's surveillance state. And Craig, this week, we'll just start with the news first. This week, the Liberal Party and the Labor Party did a deal to agree on the metadata law that's now expected to be passed next week. Now, this is the metadata law that George Brandis could not explain on a television interview, and he twisted himself in knots, and David Spears' interview with him on Sky News won the Walkley or whatever those awards are called for the best interview. This is the law that allows every single person in Australia to be spied on without a warrant. And they say it's metadata. So that means all your electronic communications they can get information on. your phone calls, your emails, and your web browsing. But the metadata bit is, when it comes to your phone calls and text messages, the metadata is the phone numbers of the person calling and the person receiving.
And the time and date.
And the time and date, but not the content. So you're safe. When it comes to emails, it's the email addresses of the sender and recipient and the time and date, but not the content. And when it comes to websites, and this is the part that's cracked everybody up, it's the URLs of the websites, it's the web addresses, but not the content. Now, that of course isn't a joke. If you've got the web address, you've got the content, right? It's that simple. And of course, that shows you, that part is so laughable. It just shows you the whole, once you allow this kind of information to be gleaned on this massive scale without any kinds of checks and balances, then they're not going to stop at the metadata, right? And the deal that the Labor Party did is forget the majority of the community. We're all fair game. They want to protect journalists. So how are they going to protect journalists? Well, it will require the government to get a warrant if they want to, when I say the government, the authorities will have to get a warrant if they want to get metadata on journalists. And that warrant will be allowed to be contested. So when they have a hearing, someone there can argue, well, that's not really, you don't really need to get that information. That person is called a public interest advocate, and they will be appointed by the Prime Minister. So
it's not an open court process where you go in front of a judge, you lay out maybe in closed session to the judge, this is the evidence we have, this is the reason we want with the warrant.
No, it's not.
It can't do that. So there's no actual natural defence.
No, and the journalists wouldn't even know this is happening.
Yeah.
The agency will go to the authority for the warrant, and the public interest advocate will turn up because it's a journalist, and the journalist doesn't even know they've been talked about.
So this journalist, the journalists, their sources are absolutely sacrosanct, right? So the journalist would have all his phones, spied upon.
Yep.
The suspects or potential people he's been talking to, or anyone, would become then subject to, with supercomputers these days, scanning, filtering, aligning.
Yep. So
you're going to use basically modern technology to literally keep an eye on the activities of people whose job it is to report what's been going on. And a lot of the scandals,
truth to power, the whistleblowers and stuff like that.
A lot of the scandals that governments try to hide should be and have been in the past uncovered by good journalism.
No, exactly.
Not hatchet journalism, but good journalism.
Now, we'll take a break in a sec. I'll say one more thing before the break, though. This is supposedly the protection for journalists that I've just talked about, except guess what? It doesn't apply if it's ASIO who wants to spy on the journalist. ASIO doesn't require having any of these checks and balances at all. So that's the deal that's agreed to. We'll take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the justification for why they've done this. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing how calling the Sydney siege an ISIS attack serves ASIO's surveillance state. And before the break, Craig, we explained this new metadata law that will allow the largest intrusion into the private lives of Australians by the authorities ever, and it really is a draconian, and we would say fascist, police state measure. Now, here's the thing. When this law passes next week, once they've done a deal between Labor and Liberal to do it, that means that all the laws that were announced last July by the Attorney General, the new suite of counter-terrorism measures, will be in place. And just remind you what those laws include. Immunity for ASIO officers and affiliates involved in an ASIO operation if they break the law. So carte blanche, do whatever you like, you're immune. Jailing of journalists for up to 10 years if they report on an ASIO operation. That's passed. There were these really controversial control orders and preventive detention orders that ASIO had where they could lock up someone in secret for 14 days, right? And they were so controversial that when they were initially passed, they had sunset clauses on them. They were due to expire now. They were renewed last year. And they were only ever used once, by the way, before they were renewed. And guess when they were used? Right before they were renewed. So these things have been on the books for a couple of years, And just before they're going to expire, all of a sudden they found an excuse to use them. That was those huge anti-terrorism raids last September in Sydney, 800 police, etc. That's when they used them. So those are the kinds of things that were passed. This metadata law was the last one because it was the most controversial. Labor didn't even put up a fight on the other ones, but this was seen as so far-reaching and so intrusive. Labor was really going, you know, I don't know, and you know, lawyers were up in arms, and journalists were up in arms, and civil liberties people were up in arms. So Labor was really equivocating until the Sydney siege, because in the wake of the Sydney siege, Labor's attitude is we do not want to be seen to be soft on terrorism, and that comes down to how crucial it is that the Sydney siege was designated to be a terrorist attack, and specifically an ISIS terrorist attack.
Well, Robbie, that's really interesting. We put out releases before. What we were discussing in those releases, the fact that the police initially had control over the situation, and what was really quite stunning, because you watch the television, you see that there are other incidents, like just this week. You had this young father in Geelong, right, who lost custody dispute of his two young sons.
This was last Sunday.
It's just last Sunday, right? And then the police handled that. He was threatening to kill people. Yeah,
he locked himself in the house with the two boys. He was threatening to kill.
Yep.
And the police were in charge.
Yeah, and they took their time. They patiently negotiated with this person, and the outcome was that everyone was released and no one was killed.
And they negotiated, Craig, for 12 hours.
Yeah, and this is what the police negotiators do. And it's not just one case, it's multiple cases. You see it all the time. What's really stunning with the Sydney siege is initially the police were in that role, and then it got cut off.
Yep. And what we know, we've had confirmed to us that when Tony Abbott made a declaration during the day that this is a terrorist attack, then the police were not allowed to negotiate anymore because, quote, we don't negotiate with terrorists. Even though, Craig, we also know that Monis, the Sydney siege hostage taker, people who know him know that his burning grievance was 2 months earlier. He'd been cut off all contact with his two young sons after losing a custody dispute, right? So that is how he should have been treated. Whatever he was also a nut job, right? And all that, an attention seeker and a grandstander. Whatever he said he might have said he was an ISIS terrorist. He couldn't even bring the right flag, for crying out loud, right? The authorities knew what they were dealing with, and that at his core, this is an angry father, but he was not negotiated with for a political reason.
Which is what the hostages were complaining about.
Yeah, they're left to fend for themselves for 17 hours. And it's also worth mentioning, yes, people died in that siege after 17 hours. That means for 17 hours, nobody was hurt. But they were left to fend for themselves. There's a huge discrepancy here. And ever since then, Tony Abbott has insisted that this siege be designated what the nut job who did it called it, with no proof whatsoever. Anyone who knows him knows that he spoke that kind of crap his whole time that he was in Australia, right? But he's insisting that be called an ISIS attack, and it's been used to do two things. One is what we're talking about. In the wake of that, the Labor Party, which should have opposed this law, and all of them should have opposed this law, wilted and said, no, this is a terrorist attack, therefore we have to let this law go through, and that's the deal we've got. And the other one was last week or the week before when Tony Abbott announced that Australia is going to send troops to Iraq. And how did that work out? Well, we're sending an extra 300 troops to Iraq because they're going to go and help train the Iraqi army. And people pointed out, well, this is an army that between us and mainly the Americans, something like $40 billion over a decade was spent training. They come up against ISIS and they wilted straight away. What's an extra 300 Australian soldiers going to do to change that situation? It was not in response to a request by the Iraqi government, though they might have formally done it. The real request came from the Obama administration. So America speaks, Australia says, aye, aye, sir. And as an aside, something that Malcolm Fraser was incredibly critical of. But to justify it, Tony Abbott said explicitly, we're sending these soldiers over there to assist in the fight against ISIS, which we have a right to do because ISIS attacked us. Right? Ergo, the Sydney siege. So it's been used for that, and now it's been used for this metadata law. And Craig, we're making an issue out of this because, you know, Australia is going down the path to what we warned many years ago, full-blown fascism.
That's right, and we pointed out a report in 2002, you know, economic development or fascist dictatorship. In that report, which is available still for people, we published all the details of the Howard fascism laws back then. There was over a dozen of them at that point. And if you don't, and the point that we've always made is that, look, if you do not develop your economy based upon the principles of national sovereignty and real economic development on national banking, not this banking system we have now, what alternatives are you going to have when people start to see their savings disappear, their standard of living disappear, unaffordability of house, and all the economic catastrophes that come with a failing economy? How's the government going to control that? Well, they're going to have to use the sorts of laws that they're putting in place now.
Exactly.
And that's what we've always said, and we've never deviated in the last 13 years on that subject. And look what is taking place now. It is exactly what we said 13 years ago. It's getting worse and worse and worse, but so is a global financial crisis, right? There are many solutions to this. They're not actually that difficult in terms of what you can do.
Which is a good way to segue. We'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about those solutions. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, 11th hour interventions to stop nuclear war, global economic disintegration. And Craig, before the break, you were talking about there are solutions to the economic crisis. Now here's the economic crisis that is pushing governments like Australia's government, the United States government, the British government to resort to fascism using the excuse of anti-terrorism laws. But there are solutions to that. So we're going to talk now about, we'll talk about the economic side of this first. I want to highlight two things, and then we'll talk about the military part. Two big developments have happened. In the last week, Britain, Germany, France and Italy, the four biggest economies of Europe, have applied to China to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This is a bank that we, here in Australia, in whose interest it is to join, still haven't joined. And this is a real fault line, strategic fault line between the United States and Europe, which, like the United States and Europe, have always been hand in glove. They jointly manage the IMF and the World Bank. They are the transatlantic economy that's dominated the global financial system up until the rise of China and Eurasia. And now it's splitting apart. And the decision by those European countries to do it is driven by, first and foremost, one thing: economic survival. And then the other thing I'll mention is there's finally been a presidential candidate in America declare for the Democrats, whose name is Martin O'Malley, and we love his name because it's the same as the American who founded the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, King O'Malley. And Martin O'Malley has declared that he will run for president, and his platform is Glass-Steagall, a Glass-Steagall reformation of the banking system. Let me read his quote and then I'll get your comment. He said on 12th of March on MSNBC, "We make the rules, and we can make better rules in order to restore that link between hard work and the opportunity to get ahead. Reinstate Glass-Steagall. For 70 years, we prevented banks from gambling with our money and wrecking our economy and riding roughshed over the common good that we share as a people, and having a stable and good economy. Everybody, I mean on both sides of the aisle, I mean so many people would say we should do that, and yet it remains undone. And some people in my own party are holding themselves out as promoting some sort of a Dodd-Frank light. Quote, we don't want to offend anyone on Wall Street, so let us not talk honestly about how we can rein in this excessive behaviour, end quote. Because one of the things we haven't talked about too much is that for all of the pain from the home foreclosures and the job losses, the concentration of wealth after each of these last two busts on the stock market actually increased. In other words, while other people lost homes, the people at the top came out even further ahead. So those two things are incredibly good developments on the economic front.
Well, it's a real break, Robbie, because, and this is what we're going to see in this period of history, because you're getting, the global financial crisis is getting worse and worse and unsolved. You're starting to see the breaks taking place in Greece, where Greece is saying no more austerity, we want debt reorganisation, we want a debt conference. You know, 3 months ago we didn't know that was going to take place.
Yep.
You now have this O'Malley character coming forward, speaking exactly what we've been saying for years now, right? But this is the nature of the sorts of crisis that we're in. The solutions exist. The solutions are not something that have to be manufactured. We have said before that we need to have Glass-Steagall in this country, a re-regulation of the banking system. We need a banking system.
You've got to rein them in and make sure that it functions for the economy.
When you go back to, say, 1893, Robbie, and you had what they call the Great Smash, right? This is where literally the banks caved in, and you had about 9 out of the 22 banks only left operating. You know, the rest of them shut their doors. The then Premier of New South Wales in that state, he turned around and began printing notes, which he then guaranteed by the government, and he allowed the banks to print those notes. Now, this was completely and utterly unheard of. And that was
so the depositors had access to their money.
Yeah, that's right. He had to keep the banks open. He had to keep them functioning. So, but this was completely and utterly unorthodox. It was surprising to the people of the day that he would actually do it, but the things were so bad that he had to keep that commercial banking system functional. And that's the sort of period of time that we're in right now. So Glass-Steagall is not something that's outside the reach of our government, of re-regulating the banking system. It's going to require massive changes to the banks, but that's a good thing, right?
And the other side of the solution is investing in infrastructure to make the economy work, and that's what this AIIB development is about.
Also, Robbie, we're the only country in the world that's had a history of national banking. I mean, we did have a Commonwealth Bank that functioned like a national bank. The founder of that bank, Denison Miller, basically stood up and said, I have the assets of the country behind this bank. And that actually, he demonstrated that with the original Commonwealth Bank through being able to raise the war loans and be able to pay for the produce and the pools and the commodity pools during the war and so forth. But what you find is that right throughout Australian history, from the 1911 period when it was established, right the way through up until it was destroyed, that bank stabilised the entire banking system in Australia. We didn't have any bank failures because of that power of that Commonwealth Bank. Now, it was destroyed because it was a national bank, and that's what we can bring back. It's already within the psyche of thousands, if not millions, of Australians. You have a national bank that literally, with the assets of the nation, creates the credit that's directed into large-scale infrastructure development projects to put, you know, many, many thousands of people into high-paying jobs, which will, of course, increase the tax base, and therefore you'll be able to deal with the other expenses that you have to have when you're in government, education and so forth to pay for that.
So we're seeing these signs where, you know, it's now starting to come to the fore, and like I said, that's what these developments are about, and they actually constitute an intervention into the economy before it falls off a cliff, and that's good. So, but just quickly, one more intervention is the flashpoint for war, Craig, that could explode into a nuclear war, and that's no overstatement. Again, that's something that Mr. Fraser talked about, is the eastward expansion of NATO right up to Russia's borders, and those forces pushing it in terms of the immediate crisis right now, wanting to arm Ukraine. Because if they armed Ukraine, then that would be, you know, pretty much America toe-to-toe with Russia right on the Ukrainian border. So what you've had, again, a break between Europe and the United States. The foreign minister of Germany, Steinmeier, went to the US last week and gave a speech where he said that should not be done. And the other person is actually Malcolm Fraser's old friend, Helmut Schmidt, the former Chancellor of West Germany, who I know they were very good friends, and they thought alike on this, and they used to talk about it. He put out a statement on the 12th of March warning that if we escalate against Russia, that is the West, it could turn into a, quote, real hot war, right? And this is the kind of wisdom that these people have been trying to put out. And unfortunately, with what's happened to Fraser, you see how delicate, you know, we need those old timers around, but, you know, we've got to speak up for them. So that's it for this week's CEC Report. Thanks for tuning in. You can get our material off our website. Tune in next week for more.